All right, Ethan, episode number 30. This is going to be a huge one. Yeah, episode 30. I mean, almost your age, right? You're 31, 32.
32. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Whew. You're almost, I mean, you're coming up on 40 here. You know.
50's right around the corner.
Yeah, 50's right around the corner. Yeah,
And
for all of
so
us.
and so big.
Yeah.
Re-
Yeah,
Remember
yeah.
those just
So anyhow, today we are going to attempt to answer the question, should you do every set to failure? Now, before we get into things, I have a couple of um, general comments on some background for our discussion, because I think there are a couple of very important things to lay out just in terms of definitions and assumptions that we should touch on. Because I think the tendency is to generally, at least in terms of how I see people answering questions, is to jump right into the actual like yes or no, or, it depends. And I think that especially for a question like this, there's a lot of like background that needs to sort of happen in terms of discussion. And I think the thing that I want to start with is just that, however long this ends up being, if you're someone who is looking for a specific number in terms of do this many sets or don't do this many sets, I think you're in the wrong place, which most of the people who are already listening to this podcast probably um, are aware of, but there's not going to be a correct answer or one answer that we're going to give. There's going to be, I think, a lot of contextualization. So without further ado, I personally think it's important to define like what we mean by failure. And the definition that I just kind of thought of this morning was failure is the non-voluntary inability to perform more reps with the same technique, right? And so when we say technique, technique is often a sort of smoke bomby, nebulous term. So I also think it's important to define that. And technique to me really just sort of sets the roadmap for how we perform an exercise. So, technique determines what kind of resistance direction we're using. It determines, how we move our bodies. It determines where we move our bodies, what specific range of motion that we use in the exercise. So failure and technique really can't be separated. And I think that is something that is important to remember, is that failure always needs to be looked at, in practice on a very specific case by case basis, right? Failure on one variation of a curl could look very different than on another variation of a curl, depending on, all the things that sort of compose technique that I just listed and how they change between variations. So now when it comes to, a potentially like one example that we could list in terms of like, okay, if failure is again, the non-voluntary inability to perform more reps within a given technique, and then we define technique as, okay, this thing that sets the roadmap or the constraints for what we're actually doing. One example might be, okay, you're doing two different variations of the exact same pull down. So let's say you're doing a traditional lat pull down with a fixed bar, and we say, okay, in this variant that I'm doing today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the end line or the end of the range of motion when I touch the bar to my chest. So when I pull the bar down to my chest, that's the end of the range of motion. And I'm going to define failure in that context as I'm no longer able to pull the bar all the way down to my chest. That's context one, right? And then context two might be, okay, well, maybe on another day, instead of pulling the bar all the way down to my chest, I'm just going to pull it halfway down. Or maybe when I fail at my chest and I'm no longer able to pull the bar down to my chest, what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow for my system to try to get as many reps as possible until I basically can no longer move out of the top. So in one instance, you've defined the technique based off of not being able to get to the bottom of the pull down. And in another technique, you've defined failure as not being able to pull any more out of the top. You have no more effort, no more range of motion available. So those are two examples of like seemingly the same exact context, where in one you've defined the end range as I'm pulling down to my chest, and in another you've defined it as I'm going to do as many reps as I can, no matter how partial they become. And those, in terms of like which one of those things we choose, will depend on a lot of things that have nothing to do directly with this discussion. So this discussion is going to mostly pertain to, okay, once we've defined those things and we've laid out those constraints in a program based off of the, the individual and their goal, et cetera, then we can start to talk about what we actually mean in a little bit of a broader sense. So weirdly, we kind of have to zoom in first, identify those things, and then zoom back out. Okay. So then beyond those two things, and I know I'm saying a lot here, so apologies in some ways, but I think it's still important. And we'll kind of rewind and touch on these specifically, E, if you want to. The only other thing that I wanted to sort of contextualize first is just the framing of the question and some of the assumptions that the question has. So the question again is, should we do every set to failure? And I think it's important not to tie ourselves to binary kinds of responses and just binary thinking, black and white thinking, which would say, okay, I either have to do every set to failure or no sets to failure, right? It's kind of a spectrum in terms of what we end up doing, wherein we could do every single set to failure, or we could do 0 sets to failure, or we could do half our sets to failure, or just the last set amongst the sets that we're doing. So when it comes to asking these kinds of questions, I think it's important to give that context of, well, this is not actually a binary situation. And in terms of the assumptions that we hold based on the question, we need to sort of address those first to be able to actually, I think, navigate it in a way that would directly impact, how we apply the stuff in practice. So those are just the kinds of things that immediately I wanted to touch on in terms of like failure, what it is, its relationship to technique, and then not getting tied to this binary response, this like black and white thinking of, okay, well, we have to do everything to failure or nothing to failure. Because as we've said on, a multiple different podcasts, this is kind of a spectrum. And we first need to sort of just identify where we are along that spectrum and the things that determine like, okay, where do we end up in terms of total sets to failure, total sets not to failure. I think that is really something that we can now contextualize sort of back and forth here. So of all those things that I kind of just rambled on about, did any one of those things kind of stick out as like something you wanted to touch on a little bit more? Or did you want to just kind of jump right into your other thoughts about, more general volume and effort related stuff?
I'm glad you came at it from that angle because I actually came at it from like an entirely different perspective.
Nice.
So I think the points you're talking about here of like, what is failure? What are the things that influence, the observation of failure? And, one of the things I'm sure we'll get into is just like, well, what's the sort of cost benefit analysis of failure, whether from a time efficiency or this, big word, fatigue. Um, those are the things that I think are, very, very like specific and nuanced. And to your point, a lot of them we've gone over in other episodes where we just try to explain the nuance of whether it be like, should we do all our sets with length and partials? And, what's the cost benefit of that? Or, what does anchoring mean and how does that affect our output? And, what are the things that matter as far as output when the goal is hypertrophy? And, how does rest periods influence that? Like, these are all things that we've talked about on prior episodes that are just like cost benefit analysis, which all also influence the observation of failure and, the cost benefits that come along with it. So in terms of like framing this question and then kind of like, um, you know, continuing to narrow down and, be sort of work in sort of a deductive way where we just start as broadly as possible as we often do. Like I'll often come way from left field and just work our way down to like, okay, now we're within a session. We have to make some choices. What do we actually do here in practical application? So the left field for me in terms of framing was just like starting with you know, what goal do they have? So the, way to sort of break this down is to start with like, who is this not for? Like, who are we not talking about? So, you have me on the podcast because, professional bodybuilder with, some expertise in building muscle mass, not because, I'm a really good, pitcher or, even like, because I'm an expert in, strength training or, performance of any kind. So, the audience we're speaking to is an audience, at least that's listening to this podcast, that's specifically interested in growing the most amount of muscle. That's what we're talking about here. So we're not talking about failure in the context of sports performance. We're not talking about failure in the context of strength training or powerlifting. We're specifically talking about training to failure for the context of building muscle. So that's kind of where I started with the framing of it. Is that kind of like I'm assuming that that's a direction we want to go. It's just focus specifically on like what are the cost benefits of training to failure for muscle growth, and how do we begin to sort of like I like to start with analogies here and kind of just get a sense of like where we're actually at with the evidence and maybe like how that parallels um, other fields that we're familiar with or that are further along in this process. Do you want me to go ahead and start there, or is there anything you want to interject
Yeah,
before?
yeah, no. So I guess a good question for you in relationship to like bodies of evidence would be, do you know of any research that tells us that training with less effort will yield more robust responses in hypertrophy? Do you know of any studies that compared, you know, one group of people doing sets closer to failure or at or quote beyond failure versus another group that didn't do, all their sets to failure? Do you know of any situations in which putting less effort into a set yielded, as good or greater responses in hypertrophy? That's kind of the starting point, is like, what does the evidence generally point to in a vacuum, there being a more robust response between those two situations?
Yeah, so it's not typical to see more hypertrophy in studies where one group of subjects is not training to failure and the other one is. It's not always just binary like that. There are lots of different ways the study can be designed, and what kind of subjects are you using? Are you using trained versus untrained? How long is the study? Are they training multiple muscle groups? Are they training one muscle group? So there's definitely a lot of factors that go into like the output we get. But just as a trend, like if we look at the latest meta regression on training to failure, it seems that there's a fairly uh, linear increase in hypertrophy as you move from training further from failure to training closer to failure. I don't feel like that's fully baked in at this point where we can say we know exactly what that trend looks like. In terms of the way they did that meta regression, there's kind of like a lot of guesswork involved in it in terms of trying to understand how far certain subjects were from failure. So for example, if I do a set at 70% of my one rep max, that's how the study is set up, and I get 12 reps on my first set, and it's prescribed as 3 sets of 12, right? The next set that I do with 70% of my one rep max for 12, I'm closer to failure, and the subsequent set again closer to failure. So it's like, even if I know that it's 70% of my one rep max, and maybe um, you know maybe I've even done like the maximum amount of reps that I can do with that weight, and even if I knew for sure like, oh, the first set is 3 reps from failure, it's like that again changes on the second set, changes on the third set. So it is pretty difficult to look back on the research and really know how far subjects were from failure in each study design, because some of the study designs are like using velocity. Some of them are using like an estimated reps in reserve, where the subjects maybe call out how many reps they think they have left. Um, other ones, like I said, are using percentage of one rep max. Others are using protocols like, drop sets, rest pause, so it is really difficult to kind of decipher, exactly how far people are from failure. And then again, all the other nuances of like, who are we talking about? What conditions are they doing it in? What pieces of equipment are they using? Um, but just as a general trend, to answer your question, like, it is not common to see not training to failure outperform training to failure in the research. And I think like the counter argument to that sometimes is like, well, in the research, they're not doing the type of training volume that people are doing in real life, that are trying to, like, optimize for hypertrophy across all muscle groups. Even if it's a really high volume study where they're doing a ton of sets for a certain muscle group, maybe they're not training the other muscle groups, or maybe they're training the other muscle groups, but they're doing it in an unsupervised fashion. So it's not exactly clear how this plays out in the real world, how all these variables, affect one another. So it's also pretty, I think most people would argue it's even more clear that uh, the relationship between volume and hypertrophy is such that, like, up to a certain point, doing more sets, promotes greater hypertrophy. But again, where that line is for a given person is all over the board. And we are at a point where things are very gray and we don't know exactly what we're looking at. So, for example, like, you could use the analogy of, well, what if we were in the same place with nutrition research? Like, what would that look like? Like, what if we didn't know the most basic element of, like, what's contributing to changes in, say, body weight, right? So we have this thing that we can observe. A person, steps on the scale, they weigh more, they weigh less. And we're measuring volume. We say, all right, well, we observe that, like, there's a pretty clear trend that, like, the volume of food someone eats has a relationship with their increase in body weight. And how are we measuring volume? Well, we just measure it by throwing food on the scale. So I throw a piece of bread on the scale, I throw apple on the scale, some spinach, Hostess bar, whatever, right? All this stuff goes on a scale, and we're like, yeah, man, especially acutely, it's like, if we just measured on the order of days, like, there's a really strong relationship between the volume of food someone eats and their increase in body weight, right? It weighs more, it sits in your stomach. So, but then, maybe that trend is not as strong, like, in the real world, where it's like, this isn't what, nutritionists and practitioners are observing. Like, chronically, it's not just this linear trend between how much your food weighs. So, what else is going on here? And then, we start to make little discoveries and start to become, more nuanced. And we say, oh, actually, there's these things, called calories, right? And, like, so it's not just like, maybe we thought, like, well, it's colors, and maybe, like, it's green foods, and, like, green foods, add, for whatever reason, just tend to add less body weight than brown foods, and then we break it down further and we're like, oh, we have these things called, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And it's like, an equal weight of fats sure doesn't have the same effect as an equal weight of protein.
Mm.
You know, that seems to, really influence body weight changes. And, like, some of these, carbohydrate rich foods are maybe, like, higher proportions of fiber versus starch. And that seems to have an effect on, this outcome of body weight. And then it's like, oh shit, we were only looking at, one small, portion of this whole equation. We're just looking at the input of calories and how many factors were involved in just the input. We also have the output of energy expenditure. You know, how much exercise activity are they doing? How much non-exercise activity are they doing? And then the interaction between those two. Because now it's like, well, certain people with, say, very, like, thrifty metabolisms, when, they start eating less, maybe they don't necessarily lose weight at the same rate that other people do. Or in the other direction, someone eats more food and they're not gaining weight as fast as the next person. And we say, okay, well, inside of this black box is this interaction between input and output. There's also the body's own adaptations to that. So there's changes in metabolic rate, but more importantly, or probably more significantly, I mean, changes in like non-exercise activity. And so it's not just, oh, we've identified what a calorie is. We've identified like, how to measure the expenditure of these calories. But then also both of those inputs change what's happening internally inside of us as we're constantly adapting to that along the way. So, in nutrition research, like we have a much clearer, picture of those inputs, outputs, and what's, happening in the middle. And we still, in practice, have to just like run a self experiment every time. But it's a little bit easier, to measure when we're talking about something like weight loss. So when it comes to hypertrophy, number one, it's very difficult to even measure that thing. Body weight, anyone, can go to Walmart or Amazon, buy a scale, and, it's going to be pretty accurate, pretty reliable, right? But we're not going on Amazon and buying like this B mode ultrasound where we can go in and say like, oh, I know exactly, how much muscle mass I put on with this program versus the other program. And on top of that, we don't know what the individual units are that really influence the stimulus. We're still in the place where we're like, yeah, there's these green things and there are these brown things. And if like the food weighs more, it's probably more. If I feel more full afterwards, that probably means I'm going to gain more weight. But we haven't really identified all the pieces that go into that equation. We're really just looking at these kind of broad stroke things, which are made up of a lot of other factors that we can't yet see. So
Mm.
right now we might be focusing on something like, well, it seems like, the more the more work you can do within a session made up of like the number of sets you're doing, the number of reps you're doing within that set, the amount of mechanical tension you're able to put on those fibers per rep, and all that kind of like summates into this output, right? But then there's all these other factors that are also like augmenting that stimulus. There's metabolic stresses happening locally, there's inflammatory responses happening locally, there's all your behaviors outside of the gym, so that's where, there really is no good research right now that is elucidating um, how these factors sort of come together directly and say like, okay, what is the optimal relationship here between the number of sets I'm doing and how hard each of those sets can be. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to give kind of the framework of where I think we're at, with the evidence right now, and how this isn't a conversation that's simply like, hey, the evidence tells us this is how much we should do. It's more of a conversation of like, this is our personal experiences, and these are the things that I think can influence the cost benefit relationship between training to failure on a given set and not training to failure.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that a lot. So if we're then to sort of try to boil things down to a little bit more of like a simplified model that someone who's not necessarily interested in analyzing the interaction between and the confounding nature of all those different variables, much in the same way that we can, start from a recommendation of like, okay, you know, you weigh this much. And so, if you want to gain weight, generally speaking, here's a good starting point for your calories. And here's a solid starting point for like a macronutrient distribution, carbs, fats, proteins, like, the ratio therein. We can maybe start from a place then now, which is like just in this conversation, which is like, okay, what would that sort of recommendation or the equivalent of that recommendation look like, for different kinds of people, right? Because obviously someone who is, 300 pounds and has a shit ton of muscle on their frame, that application is going to be very different than someone who's never trained before, and maybe someone who, has never even tracked their body weight to begin with. So from then, like zooming out for just a second before we look into any of the, micronutrient equivalents of training, which is, I think I like that analogy, that way of looking at it. Where can we kind of start then from a practical recommendation standpoint in terms of the relationship between volume and effort? Because I think that's kind of a big key to on an individual level looking at this conversation, right? Because you can't really just look at, how hard are each of my sets without also talking about how many of those sets I'm doing in the first place. So let's just start from the perspective of like, okay, you're someone who's never really thought too much about tracking anything. The first thing you need to do to begin with is identify a starting point. And the question then becomes, how do we define that starting point broadly? And how do we recommend, on a more general level, how much to do and with what effort, we should do something with, so I guess to be more concrete, if we had you know, um, a scenario where we're starting out with a beginner client, how do you go about beginning this process of identifying what would be the equivalent of like total calories or macronutrient distribution, those kinds of things, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I guess the question comes down to like, do we want to speak to like the, complete beginner, or do we want to speak to the person listening to this podcast? I know a lot of people listening are probably coaches, who have some personal goals in regards to hypertrophy, and then may also be working with clients who have goals of hypertrophy. And like, I think the reality with working with clients, if someone's coming to you brand new, it's just such a behavioral rabbit hole that it's like you're almost never constrained by like, what's optimal in regards to building hypertrophy. Because I think when you look at the studies in beginners in terms of like how much volume can they tolerate, and not only tolerate but benefit from, it seems to be in a lot of cases much higher than you would expect. And most people just aren't in a position where they're going to do that to start with. Like they're not coming to you with
Mm.
unlimited time. And also like you need to teach all of these things, right? So you can't just go in and necessarily prescribe like, all right, you're going to train 6 days a week, for an hour and a half a day. It's like we need to kind of build you up in terms of like teaching you to do each of those exercises. And it may sort of like, it may sort of fan out in terms of like, let's teach these concepts lead to the next ones. So it's almost easier to speak on like the recommendation for the intermediate, because I think the beginner just more so comes down to like building you know excitement, building habits, like things that are a little bit less about like the x's and o's, because the reality is like we've given the analogy before, someone like starting in a cast and then starting to walk again, or coming down from outer space and being subject to gravity. It's like anything that the beginner does makes them grow. Is the question really what makes the complete beginner grow the fastest, or is the question really like what's the next best step for this person? And I think you're almost never faced with the scenario of what makes a complete beginner grow the fastest. Do you know what I
Mhm.
mean? So it's like, if you look at studies in complete beginners where they're just like riding a bicycle, it's usually stationary, obviously. If they grow muscle that way, and it's like, well, we could probably, do a little bit better than that. If someone's coming to you with the goal of building muscle, like maybe don't, throw them on a bike, but maybe if they're, 80 years old and also have really poor cardiovascular fitness, that is the right choice. So I just think like that could branch out in so many directions. But the reality is with a beginner, you're almost never faced with the question of like, you are literally never faced in real life with the question of what is most optimal to build as much muscle as fast as possible with this person, who has no experience training, because they would literally have to, hire you full time, where all you did is teach them every behavior, all day long. So anyway, I think like just speaking to, you know, where people are at in terms of like what I think the audience listening to this podcast is facing, and the decisions they might be making with a client that is coming in with some training experience, in seeking their help, whether from like an online sort of consultation standpoint, or maybe it's a trainer looking to improve themselves, or someone, a client they're working with that's sort of at a plateau or has this new goal, getting jacked for a wedding or summer or what have you. Where do we start with that person who has like some experience, some habits in play? And you know I think we can get to a point in this podcast where we say like what's the direction we'd like to move people in, and what might be like the most efficient way to go about achieving the goal of sort of um, you know optimizing for hypertrophy from an efficiency standpoint as it relates to time, right? Because it's always like, what are you optimizing for? Like, are we optimizing, to do this workout in the shortest amount of time? Are we optimizing for to do this workout with the least amount of equipment? Like, there's always something that is kind of like a person's like specific wants. And I think in a lot of cases, like training to failure can simply just be like optimizing for time. It can be in some cases optimizing for like even enjoyment. But just coming back around to like, well, how do we frame like the quantitative recommendations for the average person listening to this podcast? And I think you have to start with the assumption that like you're probably in the middle of the bell curve, right? Like if you're to the far right of the bell curve, and we're saying like you just have extensive skill when it comes to setting up exercises and executing them in a way where you don't deviate from your planned technique, all the things that you mentioned in that definition, you have to assume that like you're probably in somewhere closer to the middle of the bell curve than you are to the far left or the far right. So then it's kind of like, well, what do we see with those people in studies in terms of like what actually happens, and what do we see in real life, and just kind of make some generalizations where like, yeah, you're probably in this range. And the one that you hear the most common is like 10 to 20 sets per muscle group. And I think that kind of lands you you know oftentimes somewhere in this realm of like 80 to 120 sets total per week. So maybe we just say on average it's about 100 sets ish a week, and you kind of just like partition that however you want. I think that's kind of like just the most middle of the bell curve way to start is like you're going to do 10 sets ish per body part, you're going to do 100 sets ish per week, and you're probably somewhere in the middle where it's like your technique isn't so perfect that like you can survive just going balls to the wall on every single set, and like your exercise selection isn't so perfect that like you are getting the most out of every set that you could. If all of that stuff was in place and maybe you were super strong and your recovery is on point, like maybe that changes things as far as like where you are on that bell curve. But if we just make the assumption that you're somewhere in the middle, that's where I would probably throw the dart.
Okay, cool. So that's great context. So if we're then dealing with someone who we know is in that 10 to 20 range, or at least they're starting from that point, maybe we say, okay, if this individual is at a point now where they're just beginning to track things, maybe we start at 10 sets or 12 sets at the beginning of a program. And then across those sets, we're now faced with the question of like, well, how do I then define what I call a set? Like, is a set, and again, that rabbit hole gets very esoteric very quickly in terms of all of the different variables that can potentially play into it. But if someone, in that intermediate stage is then trying to decide, well, how many of those 10 sets per muscle group per week should I do to complete failure, then we're now faced with the question of like, how do I go about creating a model that allows me to answer that question for myself? And that's obviously not a simple question. It's not, do all of them to failure or do none, like I said, in the beginning of this podcast. But I do wonder, like, if there is a good sort of model or framework that someone can utilize to begin with, if they're just trying to navigate this stuff on their own. And so the question then becomes like, how would you then go about defining that and go about laying out someone, or go about like creating a paradigm or creating a model through which someone can answer that question. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, several, not necessarily like a stepwise process for figuring it out, because a lot of it is like, observing people in the real world and making sort of qualitative assessments. But I think one way that I frame this, like, should you train to failure, should you not in practice, is actually like, are you in a position to make a significant amount of progress?
Hmm.
So I think in terms of like, really moving the needle and like seeing yourself change in any discipline, having a very specific goal and having a path laid out to get there, whether it's the correct one or not, I think is a very important part of the process. So, lifting is no different. I think you should have an idea of where you are now, where you want to go, and both on a chronic basis and, more acutely, uh, you know, have a vision of what you're trying to move towards. So when you're training to failure, it's very, very clear, assuming again that those qualitative aspects are in place and they're reproducible and reliable, you can actually decipher, am I or am I not making progress? So, and progress in this case would be like, are you improving your performance? So, are you doing more reps with a given load, or are you doing the same amount of reps, with more load? And I think that is one element of training to failure that's very enticing. Is you are getting a very frequent elucidation of where you sit as far as progress. And it might not, again, depending on how quickly you're progressing, it may not look linear. You may see sort of this wave-like form that eventually just trends up over the course of several months. And that's again, why I lean towards, as we talked about in a previous episode, longer training blocks. You may see in between, it's like, oh, this week I did 100 pounds for 16, but the next week I did it for 15. But you look back and you're like, oh, now I'm doing 100 pounds, for 17 reps, when I started this block doing 80 pounds for 17 reps. Like, it's very clear that I progressed. I see this also with like skin fold measurements. Again, if you have the skill, to be very reliable in those measurements, you look across a year or two, again, depending on how fast this person is progressing, and you're like, wow, I was 180 pounds, at 80 millimeters, and now I'm 200 pounds at 80 millimeters, X amount of, years later. You can feel good about the fact that something happened there. You know,
Hmm.
same kind of thing here, right? Like, it's just much more clear that it wasn't just like an escalation in your effort. Now, the counter to that is you can always test along the way, even if you're not training to failure. It's not like you can't do test sets where you go to failure and just see, like, have I progressed? Have I not progressed? It's just like, how frequently are you getting that feedback, and how clearly can you sort of see that trend over time? So I think what you see where people are, not in a position to progress quickly. So either they've been training for a really long time, or there's someone who's like, it's not their main focus, or there's someone who has a lot of outside life stress, their nutrition's not on point, their sleep's not on point. whatever those factors are, if you give them, you know, every set, every set to failure, and they're at a decent amount of volume, you may just not really be able to observe progression. And that can be very frustrating. And again, as I was framing in the beginning, I think it is really important to have some vision of progression, right? So whether you like create that artificially by saying like, all right, I know there's reps in reserve, but next week we're going to do more weight. So it's like, on paper, maybe a person has, 4 sets of 8 with 100 pounds, and those sets weren't to failure, or just the last set was to failure. And next week you do 4 sets of 8 with, 102 pounds or whatever. You don't actually know if you progress. You may have just tried harder, and some people will try to quantify RPE or RIR in that situation and say, oh, I wasn't trying as hard. I know that last week it was a 4 reps in reserve, and this week's it's 3 reps in reserve. Again, that's another way to do it. I just think, the most clear way to know if you've progressed, and which again also has its issues as far as reliability, is training to failure. But if you're a person who's not going to be seeing that rate of progress, or a lot of times it's just like you need to have a specific goal. I think there's a lot of cases where, you know, again, you could call it, motivation. You could you know, call it just like the ability to sort of like grind out reps. But a lot of people need to actually know, no, you're not just going to do this set as hard as you can and get whatever outcome you get. A lot of people need to be told, you're going to do 9 reps on this set. And next week, you're going to add a pound, or next week, you're going to do 10 reps on this set. So I definitely think it can come down to a lot of individual factors in terms of like, regardless, the goal is to observe progression in some way. And that's going to be very motivating. And you might set that framing up by allowing someone to see progression, even when that adaptation is not necessarily there. It's kind of like that fitness fatigue model where it's like you don't actually know exactly where your fitness is at any point because it's masked by fatigue. In this case, it's kind of like you don't really know where your fitness is because it's masked by effort. So if you're putting less effort in, it looks like you have, less fitness, right? But as you put more effort in, it looks like you have more fitness, but you don't really know that because it's clouded your effort, right? So,
Yeah, so let me just interject to give an example of what you mean by that, if people aren't totally clear, which is like, okay, if you start out a program and on week 1 you say, okay, I'm going to do a leg press, and on my first week that I'm doing leg press, I'm going to do I'm going to do a set of 10, and when I get to the 10th rep, I'm going to imagine that I could do, 13 or 14. Like you leave some in the tank. That's week 1. Week 2 is like you inevitably just created a situation on week 1 wherein on week 1 you could have done more, but you decided not to. So what you did is you set up a trajectory that you knew that you could make progress. And the question is, okay, is that kind of a thing preferred over the alternative, which would be on week 1, you just go right into the failure. And let's say you get 13 reps. And then the next week, it's like, now all of a sudden, if you maximize for effort, you maybe have a little bit of a more clear picture as to whether or not you actually adapted to that thing, because you didn't leave so much room to sort of wiggle forward, if you will, on that first week. Because to your point, I think if you do really undershoot week 1 or week 2 or week 3, you can, you could potentially get to week 6 doing a given weight for a given number of reps that you could have done on week 1. And so the illusion there is you've made all this progress, and maybe you have, depending on, where you're at in terms of just the novelty to the exercise and, training phase and where you're coming from and all those things that you mentioned earlier. But the question then for me now becomes, okay, if I as in Ben am personally someone who is super biased toward doing every set to failure, because there's for me, there's a lot less guesswork in it. I feel very comfortable, even if it's a different exercise. I feel very comfortable in my understanding of setup, execution, understanding how to fatigue, all those things. I see very little downside to doing every set to failure. But I can see the argument against that, which would be, well, not everyone is in a position to feel super comfortable doing that. So my question to you now is like, okay, if I'm someone who is in the position that I think that I'm in, would there be a situation where you would not recommend just starting week one, doing every set to failure? Because me personally, with where I'm at, I don't know if I see a super clear reason not to do that. Again, assuming all those other variables about progression and the capability to progress, being in check or are in check. So do you really see an argument against that if you're in a position to do all those things? Do you see a use case for intentionally undershooting that sort of first week phase? Because I can see the argument within certain exercises, but not others. So do you kind of have any thoughts on, if someone is in that position that I described, would you recommend starting from a place where you can, then sort of give yourself room to progress, or would you start at sort of 100% if someone was comfortable?
So the first thing I just want to circle back to real quick, because I think it's an important point, is performance and stimulus aren't necessarily the same thing. So we could say that, we want to observe, a performance increase over time. And, our preference is to be, more certain than not that we are actually observing a true performance increase. And it might be easier to observe if we standardize one element of that, in
Hmm.
case, the perception of effort. But the reality is, like, even if you could have done more, and even if you didn't necessarily like add, increase your performance at the same rate, or even increase at all, it doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't get a stimulus for muscle growth. It may just be that, you left a little bit more on the table. And there are lots of instances where performance can actually, increase more rapidly, where you get less stimulus. And that was kind of my point in the beginning about, okay, we're not talking about, strength or performance here. We're talking about hypertrophy. Because if we're just optimizing for how do I improve my reps or my load week to week, it actually might look very different than optimizing for this kind of like internal black box of stimulus and chemical signaling. So that's just to say that, like, how quickly you're observing progression, whether that be training to failure or not training to failure, is not necessarily going to be like indicative of, how much you're growing muscle, even though chronically it's going to have, it's going to have a relationship. Right?
Hmm.
We're not optimizing for like the observation of like performance acutely. We're trying to optimize for this thing again that is sort of like the calories and macronutrients that we can't quite see, and we're weighing sort of the cost and benefits of, what we know to be, um, individual components of that stimulus, at least observed on kind of a broad level, which is like, the amount that I'm doing, the number of sets that I'm doing, the number of reps that I'm doing, the load that I'm using, etc. So then to get to your question, which was like, I think I think I can frame it as like alternate universe version of Ben, right? So what you're saying is like, take another person like me, they've gone through my course, like we think that they understand exercise selection, exercise setup, exercise execution, on a high level. And what other caveats, would there be? Like, obviously we are those people and we've made this decision, so we just have to step back like a couple caveats before that and say what might be things that people aren't thinking about, right? Because if I'm me and you're you, we both do what we're currently doing, but what are some reasons, just short of being, me or you with our own biases, that may, maybe a reason for another person, not to train to failure. So we mentioned one already, which is just like, what's the rate of progression that you or your client, are sort of expecting at a given time, right? Like if this is a person who's, you know, an enhanced athlete, and you're adding, gear in, you're going on cycle, like you're going to expect to see maybe pretty rapid increases in performance, and you could make the case that like, you should capitalize on that. You could also make the case on the flip side that maybe you actually want to buffer that a little bit. Maybe like trying to, if the analogy is nutrition, you could say, all right, I'm going on gear. I'm just going to eat all the food. And it's like, yeah, you gain weight too fast and you run into issues, right? The analogy here is like you get too strong too fast, or you do too much in terms of increase in total workload. Yeah, maybe, in the nutrition example, you gain all that muscle, but you have the issue of body weight. Maybe here it's like you get all that stimulus, you grow all that muscle, but the muscle isn't the rate limiting factor. Maybe it's your connective tissue, right? So there might be a case in terms of, and I saw Joe put a question in here. So as soon as I'm done with this, I'll get to that. There might be a case of like, well, actually, maybe we want to temper the progression a little bit here. Maybe we know that this is a person who's had a lot of orthopedic issues in the past, and I actually want to like keep them from themselves. So, in orthopedic considerations, could be an issue. And you're basically just balancing that with like, how good are they actually at all the things we've described? Are they really good at analyzing like, oh, I got this nick or niggle, and like, I know what to do now, right? Like my elbow hurts when I do, tricep extensions this way, but I've watched enough of Ben's content to know like, well, if I just, add in this anchor, or if I just, change my shoulder position, if I just change, the point of application, like, I can take that away and still continue to train to failure. But that, the majority of people are not able to, troubleshoot in that way. And the majority of people run into, a bottleneck somewhere where it's like, maybe you're not prepared for, the effort gun, right? Like maybe maybe driving, on the highway is like, not the speed you want to go at. And so the analogy there, I guess, would be just like the more proficient of a driver you are, the faster you can go, because you can make decisions along the way. You can navigate, right? Someone cuts you off, going really fast, you're able to, maneuver your car around that, right? Pothole coming up, deer coming up in the road, whatever it is, like it's just if you're going to drive really fast, you need to be in control of that car, and you need to be able to navigate, on the fly. So considerations in terms of, roadblocks people can run into, I think the biggest one is always orthopedic. And, the better that you are at all the things, that you personally discuss, the more you can navigate that at fast speeds. Um, Other considerations would be, I think I would even put, orthopedic considerations under this large umbrella of fatigue. But again, other considerations under the umbrella of fatigue or side effects or costs, would be just like burnout. Like how tired do you feel? How fucked up do you feel after a set to failure? Like when you and I were doing, seated leg curls this week, and we were doing assisted reps and forced eccentrics, like both of us get out of it and are just like smiling, like totally, like we just pick up on a super normal conversation. There's like, Miley Cyrus playing in the background. Like it's just, and it's fucking heavy. It's not like, oh, it's just like the super slow set with like 50 pounds. Like it's the stack and like multiple 45s on there for, 20 reps, quote unquote past failure. So no one would look at that set, especially because, you look around the IFBB and like, I don't see a lot of people, putting that type of load on those machines. You would say like objectively, compared to what other people are doing, like that's a hard fucking set.
Yeah.
But if you observed like the emotional response to it, and also internally, like what do I feel after the set? What do I feel, 10 minutes later, an hour later, the next day? It's just so not a big deal. And that's just not something you can really observe over the time course of a study. Is just like, how do you get to the point where that's just so not a big deal to someone? So not a big deal orthopedically because of the way they set it up. So not a big deal, emotionally because of it's something they practiced over time. It's not the first time getting into an ice bath. Like I've gotten in an ice bath for 2+ hours, a day, 4 or 5 times a week. Not reality, or not actually ice bath, but just as an analogy here. If you're doing that every single day for decades, it's just not a big deal anymore.
Mhm.
You can't observe that in a short-term study. So I do think in observation, you can get to the point where it's no big deal and the orthopedic costs are very low. But it takes a lot of knowledge, it takes a lot of experience, to get to that point. And the reality is, most people aren't there. And even when I coach people, um, it's constantly working towards the point where they can, have those proficiencies, not because I feel like they need to train to failure, but, as an outcome, they're able to train to failure the more and more proficient they get at those things. So I'll leave it there. I'll
The
open.
one thing that I wanted to, because Joe has two questions here, and I actually want to interject with the second, which is, if you have a female client, do you tend to find that their performance can drop off during some parts of their menstrual cycle? And the one thing that I would say to that in my own experience is, I'm thinking of two completely different women that I've trained in the past, one of which would essentially have no impact in relationship to any of that stuff, meaning that she would come in, she would tell me, okay, like this week I'm on my period, I feel like shit. And because of where she was at in terms of her training age and her experience, it was pretty much never an issue in terms of progression. On the flip side, I've worked with another woman who was, we'll say, relative to that first person, much more advanced in terms of just her consistency, the total amount of time that she had been training, and her relative strength as a consequence of that. And what I would find is that during weeks where she would, report to me that she was feeling super fatigued, because of all those factors that within the context of a period would influence that, which I know generally nothing about. Um, it wasn't that difficult for me to be like, okay, this person is more fatigued this week. And if I did in the past try to progress that person in the same way on that given week, things would not go well and things would actually go backwards within that session. And that also didn't necessarily apply to all movements, which is another point to make, which is like, okay, well, I noticed that when this second example, the second client came in and she reported to me that, she was feeling super fatigued because she was in the middle of the cycle, that like her deadlifts would stall and get worse, and something like a trap bar deadlift would stall in progression or get worse if we tried to push things, whereas like her chest supported row or her dumbbell bench press would not, right? So it's not necessarily even just on the level of, is this person capable of progressing in all ways, but then within each of the exercise selections, how does that change? So it can be different between people, and then within the context of that single person, you can look at the different exercises they're doing, and some which may inherently be more fatiguing and higher in absolute load may actually end up being those exercises that maybe you pull back on a little bit, or maybe that you don't look to progress, and those other exercises that they're maybe either new to or they're just not as strong in relative to others. Those can be exercises that continue to progress, and I would not anticipate that would be, would make a huge difference, although that would be something that you would have to observe over, a longer time scale with more exposures to that situation and in that client. Yeah.
I mean, this is actually an area where there's just more and more research coming out all the time. So in terms of like just looking at the middle of the bell curve before, like when I said, all right, 10 to 20 sets per body part seems to be the common recommendation. The common consensus seems to be on average, no, you don't, change the training based on, where a woman is in their menstrual cycle. That seems to be like the average consensus, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to the individual, but just as a starting place, it doesn't seem to be a good recommendation, to plan training around that. But I'm sure on a case by case basis, to your point, Ben, like that's, always something that you need to consider. And I would just say, speaking, more broadly, because obviously neither one of us has our own personal experiences with, feeling those symptoms. I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think.
Um, there is a lot of carryover during, contest prep, but
Yeah.
anyway, you could even ask the broader question, right? Because there is a question underlying this too, is just it's auto-regulation, right? Like, do you believe in auto-regulation, right? And it's just a concept of like, again, you can change the time scale. Like, are we talking about, more of like a periodized approach? Are we talking about auto-regulation on a week-to-week basis, on a day-to-day basis, on a set-to-set basis? But it's this idea of like, should we make change? How acutely should we make changes based on the data we're getting back from this person, both subjectively and objectively? So, as an example, they wake up, they, got shitty sleep last night. I'm feeling really tired today. You walk into the gym. Anyone who's been training for any significant amount of time has had the experience of, I had a shitty day, or I feel really tired, or I don't feel like working out. They get to the gym, they have one of the best workouts, of their life. That happens all the time. When I'm
Mhm.
training people, for the most part, when they come in and they're like, went on a bender last night or whatever, I'm like, doesn't we're getting right back to the regularly scheduled program. And I think you'd be really surprised, I'm sure anyone as a trainer who's kind of taken that approach, you realize like, wow, it actually acutely has almost like very rarely has an effect on performance. I don't usually see that acute fatigue having an impact on performance. Now, does that mean that it doesn't like affect adaptation? Does that mean that it can't have an effect chronically? No, but personally, again, I'm more looking at long-term trends. I like to set up longer-term blocks. So I like to look at trends more on the order of like weeks than days and moments. So I'm not a person, on the smallest scale, like the most, finite scale, that's going to say, you did that set. Like, how was the pump? How fucked up do you feel afterwards? Like, all that kind of stuff, and say, okay, based on that decision, am I going to do another set or am I not going to do another set? Well, it's like, I'm going to, measure my leg circumference. How big was my pump? Like, I'm going to, look in the mirror and, have a conversation with myself about like how hard I felt that was. Like, no, I'm going to have a program. I'm going to observe those changes, chronically over time. And then that's going to influence my long-term decision making. And that might happen on the order of weeks. Like, I email my coach every week and I just do it really more of a paragraph form at this point. It used to be like spreadsheets and, inputting, a mix of objective and subjective data. I've been doing this long enough where a conversation is the best way for us to handle it. It's just like, I know sort of what to look out for. I know how I behave, how I think, under different situations of fatigue. So it becomes a conversation that absolutely influences, how we make decisions the following week. But we also know we have this timeline of X amount of weeks, and we have an idea of like what pace do we want to move, for those weeks. And oftentimes, that is really what's directing your decision making. It's like, okay, yeah, you have this much fatigue, but we also got to get this done in X amount of time. So you're always kind of weighing cost benefit there. And I think that kind of gets into this next question of, in terms of progression, would you look to push for some kind of progress each week, i.e. reps, sets, effort, etc.? And I think that question is very much framed again by like, what duration and what pace, are we trying to move at? I would say if I had to give just like a yes or no, because I often just go way left field and go super tangent on this stuff, which I'll probably still do, but I'll just start with like, if you pinned me down and said like yes or no, I would say yes. I would say in general, I would prefer to see some, progress every week or every 2 weeks. Like, I'd like to see something that's measurable. And I think, in general, that tends to be more, motivating for people. And, you can make us decisions a little bit faster rather than if, you waited a super long time, to be able to observe changes. So that's where that concept comes back to like training to failure, not training to failure is like, how do you want to set the person up for the observation of progress? some people might be totally fine with not observing. Last week they did 16 reps, this week they did 15, and then shoot, maybe another week they do 14. It's like, oh, do we cut it there? Oh, the week after that, they do 17. So some people are really okay with that non-linear trend. Other people, need to see progress, week to week to be motivated. So I think as just like a black and white, I do think over a relatively short time scale, you should be able to observe, progress somewhere. I don't think the goal is to be training at a level where you can't observe progress.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to keep in mind that there's more than just the type of progression which would be related to reps, sets, and effort, right? Like there are progress there are progressions that you can make in other vectors, such as technique improvement and tempo too. So it's important not to just look at the objective metrics as the end all be all. And I think it's also worth considering just the more subjective variables like execution uh, and your assumptions around how well you did an exercise, how well you controlled a set, how consistently you standardize your reps across the same set and then across multiple sets under fatigue. Those are also things that, specifically if a client doesn't see more weight on the bar, that I make sure to mention as like, oh, you might have done the same weight for the same amount of reps this week, but you actually did it with a level of skill that was much improved relative to previous weeks. And that's another avenue that progress can sort of occur through. And just to kind of go back a couple of steps, because I wanted to mention another example of the menstrual cycle concept was I used to have this one client who was a powerlifting client, and she was like really, really strong. And she's now at a point where she's squatting like um like high threes, low 400 pounds for sets of like two or three on the squat, and somewhat similar numbers on the deadlift. And what we would find was during those kinds of more fatigued weeks is she would see a massive dip in the squat and the deadlift, but the bench press every single week would improve in some way. So I think that's another example to then go back to this other concept of like, we can't necessarily generalize the progression across all exercises or failure across all exercises, because different exercises will yield different outcomes in relationship to these concepts. So that was also something that, just going back to some of the things you were talking about before we got to Joe's questions, like some of the other things that can influence this relationship to failure and the relationship to progression is simply just the kind of exercise that you're doing, more specifically, like how quote unquote stable is an exercise, because your perception of failure and your perception of progress may be very different if you're doing an exercise that is a much higher skill demand in terms of just all the things that you have to consider. So if you take two examples, one of which is a free weight squat, the other of which is, a hack squat or a pendulum squat or a leg press, which is much more constrained, it's much more likely that you're going to not only be able to fail safely in the options that are more anchored, the machine-based options, but it's also more likely that you're going to be able to see a little bit more standardized and consistent repetitions and also progressions as a consequence of the fact that the exercise is more constrained and you have fewer options to actually resort to, right? So something you see a lot in the context of like a powerlifting program are fluctuations week to week that may just be entirely dependent on how someone executes a motion, right? Like the difference if you're doing a 1 rep max between uh, actually completing the lift and not completing the lift could be, half a centimeter difference in where your foot pressure is, right? So when you're talking about exercises that are, and I don't want to use the term less skill demanding, more just like where you have fewer total movement options, right? So in a leg extension, you got pretty much one option, in terms of the direction you move the pad. In something like a back squat, you can kick your hips back, your stance can be different, right? Your balance can be different, and that can yield very different responses in the perception of failure. So I think just sort of stepping back for a moment and going back to where we started, exercise selection impacts this discussion just as much as anything else. And I think that specifically in relationship to exercises where you have more options, right, more ways in which you can deviate the technique, those are exercises, generally speaking, that in terms of, the failure stuff can be harder to standardize. So to the question of like, should I make everything to failure or should I not, other than all the things we've already contextualized, I think that the exercise selection component should be considered almost as a primary thing that you look at for whether or not you decide to, on average, use higher effort sets versus lower effort sets. A good concrete example of this, even in the context of, a more anchored, externally supported option, would be that I recently reintroduced pendulum squats to my program. And although I was already doing, a decent amount of leg extensions week to week, I wasn't really pushing the pendulum squat to any degree. I wasn't really adding load. I wasn't really even in the first place doing it for too many sets seriously. So what I did on the first week of introducing it was I did 3 sets, only the last of which was to failure. And then the second week that I did it, I did 3 sets, and the second 2 sets were to failure, and the first one was not, right? And so even just introducing a new movement, a movement that was novel, although it was constrained, and although I had done it before, the total amount of load that you're using on an exercise has an ability to strongly influence, I think, that decision-making process. And generally speaking, as a rule, I like to kind of follow the guideline of, well, if I'm using a lot more absolute load, it's probably likely that I'm going to be able to, stimulate a given tissue with sets that are not as close to failure. And if I'm not using as much load, it's more than likely that, I may need to actually be a little bit more intentional about doing harder sets. But that's obviously, needs to be looked at on a case by case basis and just on a joint fatigue basis, right? So the difference, for example, in this case, between the pendulum squat and the leg extension was simply just that the pendulum squats load your knees in a much more, we'll say, mechanically potentially problematic position. That's like the clearest way that I feel like I can put it, which is that like leg extensions, generally speaking, are less fatiguing on the knee joint specifically relative to something like a pendulum squat. So with the higher risk, higher cost option, you may want to be a little bit more conservative, at least at first. And then eventually, if you find that like you can apply those same failure techniques that exercise, I don't see, a problem with that. But it all kind of comes back to just, factors that are not just related to should I do more or less in terms of effort on this one thing. Did anything come up for you, E, in relationship to any of those, or should I so I have some other questions here to address?
Yeah, I mean, I actually like purposely avoided the like exercise selection piece because I knew we'd get there at some point as like a closing statement. But usually, like if I listen to podcasts on this topic, that's usually like the only takeaway that what people will give is they'll say like, if you're doing, a more complex movement, like you gave the example barbell back squat, then probably train further from failure versus, if you're doing like a barbell curl, a lot of people, or, a curl, a lot of people will say, oh, just, take it to the house. That's kind of the middle ground, right? Some people are more conservative where it's like everything we're going to start with a few reps in reserve and maybe we'll end the training block, by training to failure. But I would say like the middle ground is people saying like, all right, what we, you know, perceive as like a more complex movement, we'll do further from failure and things that, we find more constrained, we'll do closer to failure. And maybe the other framework that they'll give sometimes is just like rep ranges, maybe with like heavier loads, we can stay a little bit short of failure, whereas with lighter loads, maybe we need to go to failure. That's often the case. And then that's often the case in terms of like what people bring up and just the idea that it seems like there's evidence leaning in the direction of like if the weight is heavy enough, there's sort of enough mechanical tension like right off the bat where maybe you're recruiting as many fibers as possible to move that load, and the recruitment and sort of fatigue process of all those fibers is enough, even like short of failure. Whereas like if you're going to pick a light load and you want to recruit those, high threshold motor units, like maybe you need to get really close to failure. And then the last thing they usually bring up is like, well, training with really high reps, closer to failure might potentially be, more fatiguing. And when they say fatigue, a lot of times what they're actually referring to in terms of how it's measured is just a decrement in force output. So it's like you do really high rep set, and then you go test, let's say for example, your 1 rep max, that there might be a higher decrement either the next day. There might be more higher markers of muscle damage, like all these sort of things that are kind of like um, more important when it comes to performance, and kind of less important when it comes to like, well, what's the net result? Like when we actually look at longitudinal studies where people train with high reps, or we actually look at longitudinal studies where people train to failure, does that stuff seem to get in the way? And the reality is it doesn't. So you can point acutely and say, oh, it's more fatiguing because it drops your performance, or it's more fatiguing because, creatine kinase or whatever. Um, but the reality is when you look at it longitudinally, that's not what we see. So you can start with like, oh, we observe this thing, here are the mechanisms. Or oftentimes people will start with like, this is what we think the mechanisms are, so this is how we're going to design a program. And a lot of times that's problematic because the evidence in terms of like what we see displayed either in the real world or longitudinally across time and in research, if that's not the observed outcome, then we're missing some part of that equation. So those are kind of like, the most kind of common stories that I hear when people are talking about this concept, on podcasts. And I think, we offered a lot of additional nuance in terms of like, well, what the hell is this thing we call failure? Like, um, how are we actually defining fatigue? What are the things that can influence our perception of fatigue? Um, what is the stimulus we're actually looking for? Is it, performance, or is it not measured in performance? So I think we did a good job of just applying a lot of extra nuance outside of just saying like, yeah, do it on these exercises, don't do it on these exercises, do it for these rep ranges, don't do it for these rep ranges. um, and then just to finish up, I think when it comes to training for hypertrophy, like I think the reality is a lot of people are limited by the exercises they have available to them. Like I'm not going to expect for a moment that everyone's going to have the machines that they wish they had, or the machines that we have access to. So that's just the reality. Like, is that necessarily what they would desire, or what, we would consider optimal? No, probably not. But it is the reality for a lot of people. So there is a huge difference between the reality someone's facing in terms of what is their actual expertise, what is their actual time constraints, and what is their actual like environment in terms of what they have access to, whether that be equipment, spotters, education, etc. Again, the reality is most people are in the middle, and they don't have access, to the optimal equipment, know exactly how to troubleshoot, know exactly how to sort of, buffer the fatigue that could theoretically come along with just training harder. Um, so kind of with all that being said, like I think when it comes to sort of optimizing for building muscle mass, like if you don't have an emotional attachment to an exercise, be it a back squat, bench press, etc., I really don't see, and you have access to other equipment where that maybe is a little bit more constrained. I don't see a huge downside, to training with more effort on that type of equipment versus, tying yourself, to training with less effort, on equipment where you do have more movement options. Like, I'm sure the argument could be, made. It's kind of like, one for one. It's just a matter of personal preference. But my opinion would be that I would lean towards things like a hack squat, for example, over a back squat, or a deadlift when it comes to sort of optimizing for this equation of fatigue and building muscle mass.
Yeah, and I had on that note, I had a conversation with someone a couple days ago where he I was talking to this guy who was essentially asking, or we were talking about the differences between like the more complex quote unquote motions and the more constrained motions. And it's interesting how the story on social media usually goes something like someone will say, like a Tom Platt's opinion will be like, you should do squats because squats are the best and they're super hard. People like doing leg press because it's easy. And I actually think that 99% of the time, it's actually the opposite, because what people end up doing on the more, or we'll say what people end up doing on the less constrained motions is they end up deviating away from a technique when they start to approximate failure or not going to failure to begin with. And what people generally do on more constrained motions, because they have fewer movement options, is they end up getting actually deeper into fatigue for target tissues as a consequence of the fact that it's more constrained. So it's interesting that those kinds of movements, they don't generally feel harder in terms of the skill demand, and in some ways they are. Putting a bar in your back, for example, with 400 500 pounds is not an easy thing, but the question is not whether we should do easy or hard things. It's should we do things that are more or less aligned with the particular goals we've laid forth. And so I guess if you don't really have a specific goal, it's kind of hard to
Hardware, right? It's just a limiter,
yeah.
right? Like, do you want your limiter to be skill? Do you want your limiter to be, cardiovascular fatigue? Those are the things that you're perceiving all of these inputs, even, putting the bar on your back, like the fatigue associated with axial loading. Like, is that a fatigue that is beneficial to you? Like, are those the things that you want to be your limiting factor? And I would just say, in general, it would make sense to make your limiting factor most of the time local muscular fatigue.
Hmm. Yeah. So just kind of to summarize, to finish up here, one of our group members, Piotr, who I call Big P, he he had a series of points underneath of the forum in the group, where he basically was just laying out four different generalized points about sort of subcategories of of this topic. And we've kind of actually touched on all of them, but just I kind of want to just briefly run through them just in summary per what we discussed, because these in some ways you could consider like the micronutrients of this particular analogy. And so the first would be go into failure on more complex versus less complex movements, right? Which we just discussed. Movements that are less constrained are going to generally be harder and less safe to go to failure on, as compared to movements that are more constrained, because you can standardize them and they're more localized, as we just discussed. Number two would be the differences in responses between different types of muscles and muscle groups. So for example, training to failure on your back day may look very different than training to failure on your leg day. Certain muscles like the lats, you may do one exercise where you train all of them to a high degree of fatigue, or really one of them to a high degree of fatigue. So that's another consideration. There's the psychological, this is number three, the psychological component of training to failure. So different types of people can kind of respond differently to different strategies. For example, certain people have lower pain and discomfort tolerances. Other people may actually be actively seeking that. And which of those things, or which of those types of people you run into or are yourself, can play a role in whether you do just more total volume in terms of sets, and where each of the sets are less strenuous, versus like if you're someone who just is a total sadist and you like to get dark on everything, doing fewer sets that are maybe harder, assuming all these things are sort of in place as we discussed, may be a good option. And then lastly, he writes the importance of coordination in skill, and just in terms of like total composure under fatigue, which kind of relates to the first and the third points. So in other words, the more skilled that you are, and the better that you get at coordinating yourself under fatigue, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to sort of move in the direction of being able to do more sets to failure with lower associated costs compared to someone who's maybe less experienced. So I think that's a decent kind of summary in terms of just a lot of the different points that we touched on. Any final thoughts or conclusion in relationship to any of those, or anything else that you feel like is worth mentioning, or no?
Um,
All right. Sweet.